So to understand sous vide, we should first talk about a conventional way to cook. Let's say you're going to cook a steak in a pan. In that case, the pan is probably around 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And that 300 to 400 degrees Fahrenheit is way hotter than you want the steak to be. Suppose you want the steak to be medium rare. Medium rare for a steak is going to be about 125 to 130 degrees. So you have a 300 or 400 degree heat source, and you're trying to cook the center of the steak to be, say 130 degrees. Well, that means that in the steak there's going to be a thermal gradient in temperature where it's 300 or 400 where the steak is contacting the pan, and then the temperature will fall and you're trying to get the center to be 130. Now you can do it, but that requires very precise timing. If you're off by even a few seconds, you'll overshoot your 130 or you'll undershoot it, and you'll have food that isn't properly done. The temperature gradient means that you'll have a thick band of gray meat where the steak touched the pan. That meat will be overcooked. It won't be your desired medium rare. It will be well done. In fact, in a typical steak that you cook in a pan, something like 25 to 35% of the steak will be overcooked. It will be above the temperature that you're asking for. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative with sous vide cooking is to take a steak and cook it in water that is 131 degrees, 132 degrees. So only a couple degrees above the temperature that you've desired. Now that means that there's a very low temperature gradient. It's effectively the same doneness from one edge of the steak to the other edge. Now there's a catch, and the catch is it takes a long time for the heat to soak through the steak that way. So whereas you might cook a steak for 5 minutes on each side in a frying pan, when you put it sous vide, it might take 25 to 45 minutes for the heat to slowly leak all the way through. Now, the other problem is that we're used to having the outsides of our steaks seared with the wonderful brown colors and flavors that come from the Maillard reaction. So typically when you do sous vide cooking, you're using one method, sous vide, to cook the interior. You're using a very different method to finish the outside. I like to finish the outside of a steak with a blowtorch, but you can also use a super hot pan or several other techniques. So the key idea is cooking with precision. Now, precision gives you a tremendous set of benefits. Salmon is a great example. In cooking salmon, you can go from cooking it at maybe 110 degrees. It's actually the temperature of a pretty warm hot tub, up to much higher. Every temperature that you cook it at will have a different texture, a different color, a different experience for people to have. If you cook it at 110 degrees, typically the salmon will not change color. It'll look dead raw. Even though it will have a texture that's cooked, it'll look raw. If you move it up to maybe 113 degrees, 115 degrees, something in that range, it'll now look cooked. To my mind, it's perfectly done at that stage. Now, if you want the outside of your salmon and the skin to be crispy, then of course you can use this other cooking technique to do that. One of the great misconceptions in sous vide is that it's about vacuum packing. Another great misconception is that vacuum packing is dangerous because it's in plastic. So the very first people who experimented with sous vide were in a Swedish hospital system. They wanted to cook in a central kitchen and ship the cooked entrees out to a set of 6 or 7 hospitals. It was a great idea, and to make that work, they used a new technology of vacuum packing, which helped seal the food in, keep oxygen off, keep it sterile, and keep it fresh longer. Vacuum packing has all those properties, and it's very convenient. So they started off this idea, hey, let's vacuum pack as part of sous vide. Well, today chefs still vacuum pack, but you don't have to. Actually, any sous vide technique will work if you seal the food in a canning jar, mason jar or cur, ball, any of those canning jars will work just fine. It takes a little bit longer for the heat to soak through the thicker glass than it does the thin plastic, but they certainly work. You don't even need to have a cover. If you have a low temperature steam oven, such as CVAP or a combi oven, in those you can cook directly at the low temperature. So the food can be uncovered, doesn't need to be sealed at all. Vacuum sealing is still part of sous vide for many chefs because it's a very convenient thing to do for other reasons. It's a great way to store food. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't oxidize. Probably the single biggest thing that makes food go bad is oxidation. Now, food will still go bad if it's vacuum packed, so you have to refrigerate it and you have to follow food safety procedures to make sure that when it's hot, and it's cold, and it doesn't spend much time in the sort of the tepid danger zone in the middle. But vacuum packing for sous vide is really only a convenience. A nice convenience, but it's logically a separate thing. But then that brings up another question. People say, but what about cooking in plastic? Isn't there some terrible thing that's going to happen that, weird chemicals will leach out of that plastic and go into your food? Well, in this case, there's a lot of evidence that that's not the case. For more than 20 years, people have made laboratory equipment using a plastic called polyethylene. It's common in almost any biology or chemistry lab. There's tons of polyethylene containers. Polyethylene is very well characterized in terms of what leaches out of it, what doesn't. If it didn't, you couldn't use it in these critical laboratory applications. Now it happens polyethylene is also the plastic used in Ziploc bags and saran wrap and in sous vide bags. So I don't think that there is any rational fear that the polyethylene that's used in sous vide bags has any health consequence. There are some plastics that do have an issue. PVC-based plastics can have some chemicals leach out of them. It's very well known. Yet they still are sold in some places for food wraps. Somewhere on the thing it usually says, please, don't use with heat or something else. But if you go to a big warehouse store and you buy a big thing of clear cooking wrap, look carefully, that's almost certainly PVC. So if you do care about plastic leaching into your food, avoid PVC. But polyethylene has really been very well characterized. The process of sous vide is very different than traditional processes. Instead of cooking with this high heat source very dramatically for a short period of time where timing is everything, you cook for a long period of time at low temperature. The timing issue goes away. You have to allow enough time so that the heat will transfer through the food, but if you're 10 minutes early or you're 10 minutes late, it really makes no difference. In fact, you could, for most sous vide processes, being hours late doesn't matter at all. So it's the ultimate convenience way to cook. It's also the best way to cook so you get repeatable results every time. Instead of having to judge, is that steak done, is that steak done, the steaks are all done to the exactly the same temperature every time. Why? Because the water bath we use has a digital thermostat in it. And that digital thermostat will regulate the temperature to within 1 degree typically, which means for all intents and purposes, it's perfect. Now, there's some people who look at this with horror and they say, oh my God, doesn't sous vide take the soul out of cooking? And I say, well, for me, I can only speak for myself here, I don't think there's a lot of soul in being a thermostat. So, yeah, I'm using a digital thermostat to regulate the temperature instead of me watching the steak and poking it. And as a result, it'll be perfect. Whereas if it was on the stove, sometimes I'd overcook it, sometimes I'd undercook it, and I couldn't do other things in the kitchen. To me, there's no soul in overcooking something. There's no great benefit in saying, oh yeah, I served it more done than Frank would like, and way too rare for Roxanne. I mean, that kind of mistake, that isn't about soul, that isn't about creativity. Meanwhile, the rest of cooking is full of creativity and opportunities to have unique combinations of flavors and textures create something that's just amazing. So I completely reject the idea that sous vide takes the soul out of cooking. It's the kind of Luddite Stockholm syndrome sort of thing that some people get attached to, but I don't get it.